I think all these artists understand that they live in a moment that is not normal, that is quite extraordinary. The idea that you would be just kind of taking this world as a world. So this is just kind of the quality of our times, I think. My name's Philip Tinari.
那我就换到中文了。
The interesting thing is that you have this now generation, which is kind of both Chinese and international. Part of this is about the rise of China, sure. The other part of it is about the rise of the internet. The shared context is so great that it's kind of just like back and forth in this way. Is really something. I came to Beijing really in 2001 in the fall. Even at that time, was starting to go to a lot of exhibitions and meet a lot of artists and write about what I was seeing and encountering. Here was the UCCA. I came here in the end of 2011. And in short, I mean, the idea is simply to do a very high quality contemporary art museum program. In terms of UCCA as a world, like I was just talking about with these artists, that you can walk into here and that everything we do makes sense in the context of who we are. So I mean, if you want to talk about specifically, I mean, the kinds of artists I'm really drawn to are ones who, because I do believe in this kind of story of the emergence of an avant-garde in China, over the last 3.5 decades now. So I'm always interested in people who have an interesting relation to that overall narrative. The artists that I find myself drawn to are the ones who, through their work, through their thinking, and even sometimes through their persona, kind of create a world. And it has to be generous so that you can kind of go inside and you've entered into, the space of this artist's work. And you want to stay there. The overall feel, it has an integrity, it has a consistency, and it has an originality. That draw you to it and that keep you there. This has nothing to do with what medium they're working in, with how old they are, what gender they are, what country they come from. It's something but it is the thing that distinguishes, I don't even know if I'd say great artist, but a good artist from, an artist. There has to be a versatility, there has to be a depth, there has to be an intensity, there has to be I think above all it's actually really it's an integrity, not an integrity of the person, but an integrity of the world that they create. I can go in and stand in the center and around me is, if I understand every single work that you've made, from the beginning onward, it feels like a body, a consistent whole. I'm sure one that evolves over time and one that maybe changes drastically at different points, but one that's real and one that's distinctly of that artist. So I came from a time, it was the late 90s in a liberal university like Duke, where a lot of the discourse was about cultural globalization. At the same time, it was also a moment when the US was very dominant. But you also saw signs of the new order that was emerging. The early days of contemporary art, let's say the 80s and 90s, so much of the market was dependent on foreign buyers that it kind of had to be open to outside influences in a way that that literature, for example, didn't, or even film didn't. So there was a place there. Got into a lot of situations of processing text, making text presentable for an international audience. And then, of course, people become your friends, and so I'm here, I speak Chinese, I work in this society, in this context. There are so many Chinese academics or professionals, in the US completely integrated into that society as well. Those first few years, it was interesting because it was still, it was like the very tail end of a kind of underground moment in the art scene. And it was before, just on the level of daily life, there were only a few places where you could get a coffee. Or what I saw was the kind of, it was the beginning of something. It was definitely this sense that there was about to be a great explosion of contemporary art. Through Xu Bing, I knew Feng Boyi, and so, the first time he called me was to go to an exhibition in Soho, the very first of the Soho development. Even the idea that you had these apartments where the floors were finished and the walls were white, it wasn't an empty concrete shell that you had to install yourself, was revolutionary. By the time it was like July or August of 2003, feeling that I should go back to the US. I was a graduate student at Harvard, so I had coursework. I was also spending a lot of energy trying to, like, for example, pitching editors in New York, oh, I'd love to write an article for your magazine or your website about this new place in Beijing. It's called 798, and you would get a lot of responses that were like, oh, this sounds very interesting, but, we really only care about what's happening in the US, so, maybe it's not appropriate for us right now. You felt, it was weird because you definitely felt for a period like you're kind of like an advocate for China or almost like an evangelist. You knew that this was going to become a mainstream topic, that this distance was going to drop away very quickly, but you couldn't tell anyone, or you could say it, but no one would quite believe you yet. So it was a little bit frustrating. For about 6 months in 2005 into 2006, I worked for Sotheby's, the auction house in New York. You find yourself at dinners and meeting people and talking to people. And that was a time when I realized very directly that I was really interested in what was happening in contemporary art in China, and that it was silly to be in New York. It felt much more interesting to be on the ground and sort of seeing firsthand what was going on here. And that was really the time when I decided that I should move back, even if I didn't know exactly what I would do when I got there. That you kind of left. And of course, in the couple years that I was away, that's really, again, when the explosion, began. It was 2004 when there was the first auctions of Chinese contemporary art in Hong Kong, and then it was 2005 when you had Chinese Pavilion in Venice. It was kind of like milestone after milestone after milestone was just starting to happen. 2005 is the year, for example, the Uhlans decided to take this area and turn it into an art center. It was a moment of insane growth. Those few years were really special. I mean, really. And the first few years did a lot of different things. I was working for people like Art Forum, the Art Fair Art Basel, but also doing some of my own sort of publishing, translation, editorial. And then in 2009, I had the opportunity to start a magazine called Leap, which I ran for about 2 years. And getting more and more interested in the actual context in China. For example, like doing the magazine, it was a media, but it was also a kind of institution. It was the perfect thing at the perfect time because you could sort of put all of your energy into it. And by developing the magazine, you're also developing yourself. You're also contributing to, the environment and creating something. And it's probably the closest I ever felt to like how I imagine artists sometimes feel in terms of when they finish a new work. It's a little bit like that. You should be able to open an issue and it feels like you have the whole thing laid out before you. I mean, of course, it's an illusion, but that's your job as an editor to create something like that. I think that this is in a way, is a very lucky generation because they have come of age at a time when the barriers to information have fallen so quickly. I think everyone's visual vocabulary has become so ecumenical and so sophisticated that you really have a new level of sophistication. The thing you want to show about this generation is that it is so diverse, which is kind of like an empty point, you know? It's like, oh, look at this generation, they're all the same generation, but they do so many different things. I mean, I think the amazing thing about artists generally is they tend to be able to keep up with the times in terms of their thinking, you know, and to be very flexible and very astute.